Good evening, everyone. Stuart McConey here, and I'm delighted to welcome you to an unusual but very special event, the launch of Jonathan Davidson's new book, A Commonplace. Yes, we are here, as it were, in a sense, to crack a fine bottle of champagne against the hull of this wonderful new collection. So, to do just that, would you welcome to the stage your host for the evening, the equally, if I may say so, wonderful Jo Bell.
Thanks, Stuart, and welcome again to the launch of Jonathan Davidson's new and life-enhancing book, A Commonplace, published by the Poetry Business at the end of this month. I'm Jo Bell. I'm going to be hosting this event tonight, introducing you to Jonathan himself, and to guest readers he's invited to share his sample of the book, including Sue Brown, Gregory Ledbetter, I'm afraid me as well, and Peter Sansom. We've got a couple of audio recordings of poems from the book by other readers too, and we need your input. At the beginning of lockdown, it looked as if events like this might be a kind of limitation. But as time has gone on, we've realized that it offers us a different kind of community, a different kind of interaction. So if you're watching us on YouTube, we not only want your comments, we need them. There's going to be a Q&A session later on where some of your questions are going to be addressed to Jonathan. So listen well, and please do type into the comments any questions you want us to answer later. In a moment, we're going to show you the cover of this new book, and I'll introduce you to the author. But first, I wanted to set the scene with a few words for those of you who haven't felt Jonathan Davidson's impact on the world of poetry. We sometimes speak of people as a pillar of the community, and Jonathan is exactly that. He stands in the centre of the English poetry community, inconspicuously holding up a great part of it without drama. He's a writer of poetry and radio drama, and an innovator in presenting poetry on the stage. Like all poets, his own writing is always informed by his own reading. And in his last book on poetry, and now again in A Commonplace, Jonathan acknowledges that debt very explicitly and builds other poets' work into a single elegant structure with his own. It's a generous approach, an unusual approach. All poets travel in the company of others, but as far as I know, only Jonathan is incorporating their work in this way to make that sense of community and togetherness explicit. It is really about a common place. That's what he's creating. He's always emphasizing what we have in common as writers and readers and humans. And he tells us in the introduction that we might need a flask and some sandwiches along the way. Because of the way we're doing this, you might actually be able to do that tonight with a bottle of wine or a plate of after eight. Is it after eight? Yes, it's after eight. So open the after eights, open the flask, get your sandwiches ready, and prepare for a journey in good company. So let's start by actually taking a look at the new book, because it has a very striking cover, and we're going to show you that cover with its brilliant graphic image of Liddered Power Station. And now, to explain that and to tell us more about the book, I'm going to introduce you to Jonathan Davidson. Hello, welcome.
Hi, Jo. I'm here. So are you.
Good evening. Congratulations on the new book.
Thank you very much.
And can you start by telling us what's inside it? What's inside that book? Why does it take the form it does?
Well, yes, it's not an ordinary slim volume. It's slightly fatter than the normal volumes I produce. First of all, it does have some of my poems, probably 30, 35. I honestly haven't counted them. Poems by other poets, because as I was putting the book together, I realized that I rarely read my own poetry. I read obsessively other people's. And over 35 years, 40 years, maybe longer even, of reading poetry and listening to it, I'd grown to know and love a number of many individual poems, and I wanted to feature some of those in the book. So along with my poems, there are also a dozen poems by other poets. Some of those poets are well known to people, some of them are less well known. All of them will have been, as we say in the trade, previously enjoyed. So these aren't necessarily new poems, they're poems that have been around for a while. So I have the poems. And then as I was writing the book, I realized that in order to explain how the poems came about, and in order to explain why I'd chosen poems by other people, I also needed to say a bit about what had happened in that process. So I decided to write a commentary to just introduce the book, to welcome people to what they were going to be reading, and then to explain why this poem was here and why the next poem was there, and perhaps a little bit about the background to a poem and a bit about why I loved another poet's work so much. So a commentary started to develop. And then as I spent longer working on the book, I realized that sometimes my commentary wasn't enough explanation, and I needed to resort to one of my favorite hobbies, which is to apply footnotes, often disagreeing with myself. So there are footnotes in the book, a whole range of footnotes which are at the foot of each page. So if I mention something like a quadratic equation, for instance, and you think to yourself, I bet Jonathan doesn't have a footnote that tells us all what it means. So I've included footnotes. And also the poems often mentioned individual places. As I've realized when I've looked back at this book, it's a lot about places I've been to and places I come from, geographical places as well as emotional places. So there is a gazetteer. All poetry books should have a gazetteer, so that armed with the flask and aforementioned pack of sandwiches, you could make the journey to every single place I've identified. It might take a couple of buses. You may need to change in Kyiv to get a bus to Vilnius, but that's possible. So there's a gazetteer listing all these individual places. And then finally, to sum the whole thing up, there is a...
I was going to say, or you might need a Brompton folding velocipede, which is your preferred method of travel.
Yes, indeed. I always keep a folding bicycle about me, as I'm sure most people do. And so finally, there is a list of all the books and pieces of music and websites that I've consulted in the course of making the book. So the book is full of stuff which isn't normally in a poetry book, but hopefully it'll make it a more enjoyable read for a reader, and more importantly, it will give readers directions that they can head off on their Brompton with their flask and sandwiches, because I don't want them to stay with this book. I want them to go and leave me behind and go and read in other places.
But it's the nature of a commonplace book that it has different voices and different extracts and so on in it. Could you just tell us a bit about what originally a commonplace book was? Because a lot of people don't know, I think.
Yeah, well, I mean, up until a couple of years ago, I suppose I didn't really know. I came across the phrase. I had this idea of a commonplace. Somehow it seemed something I'd heard about vaguely, and I was looking for a title for the book and did some research and found that a commonplace book was a book that a person of who had an interest in learning, perhaps, or in gathering information together might keep, starting from the 15th, 16th century, a book of quotes and references and perhaps poems. And as time moved on, it became a book also with cuttings and so on in the Victorian era. And it became a book that you would build yourself. It would be your own little journey, something you could read on a railway train if you wanted something more thrilling than your diary. So suddenly the phrase commonplace seemed to be right for the book I was creating. But of course, also, as I realized almost towards the end of writing the book, I was writing a lot about where I had come from. Not the geographical place exactly, although Didcot Power Station is my heimat, but the kind of social and political place I'd come from. And my family are, thank goodness, extraordinary and ordinary people, and that's where I come from. So I come from a common place, and I've created a commonplace book to discuss that journey.
Thank you. We're going to move on in a moment to hear from our first guest reader. But before we do that, I want you to tell me why Didcot Power Station is on the front of your book.
So Didcot Power Station, power for the nation. I lived in Didcot from the age of about 6 months. And I suppose I left it probably when I was 22, 23. But I've been going back regularly to the town where my mum and dad lived and now where my mother lives. And Didcot Power Station was always the thing you saw on the horizon as you came down the A34 and you knew you were approaching home. For people who live in or around Didcot, they have a love-hate relationship with the power station. Right-thinking people realise that it graces the scene, and it was a beautiful symbol of modernity, and it gave us power. It also gave us a strange, bizarre little microclimate. So it would sometimes rain in Didcot when it was not raining anywhere else, and we all believe that is because of the power station. So the power station is very important to me. And Anna Dillon, the artist who's painted this wonderful painting, which is called the Industrial Henge, I came across her work purely by accident a few years ago, and then found that she'd not only painted marvellous paintings of the Ridgeway and the Downs and other parts of the natural world, largely in the south of England, but she painted a number of paintings where she'd explicitly wanted to include the power station, because for her, growing up just outside Didcot and going to a school in Didcot, the power station was very important to her too. And clearly we shared that understanding. So the power station is a symbol of where I've come from. It's a symbol of the future of modernity. And I come from a progressive family, and we believed in progress and in people having electricity. And in the last couple of years, it's also taken on a slightly dark tinge. It no longer exists. And in its demolition, it was a three-phase demolition. And in the first phase, tragically, 3 men who were demolishing the power station were killed. The demolition was undertaken very badly. And then in the second and third phase, when they were demolishing the final bits, they managed to cut off the electricity to much of that part of Oxfordshire. And in fact, I remember my mum's carer phoning up saying, there is no electricity for the fridge, what's happening? And I checked the news, and yes, the power station had collapsed and it had taken its final revenge on everybody. That was a building that didn't want to disappear. And I miss it now it's gone. So I'm really glad that my book has got this marvellous picture of this extraordinary piece of engineering on the front of it to remind me of where I've come from.
It does, and it's a great image, and it's a great title. A commonplace book in the old sense is always a sort of collaborative reading, and that's exactly what you've done here. And in that spirit of sharing, we're going to hear in a moment from our first guest reader. So I'd like to invite you to listen to and welcome fellow poet Sue Brown, who is going to read now Jonathan's poem, Frederick Arthur Davidson. And in a common pattern for the rest of this event, she's then going to follow it with one of her own poems. Welcome, Sue.
Thank you. Hi, Joe. Hi, Jonathan.
Hello,
Thanks
Sue.
for inviting me to be part of this. This is just wonderful. Thank you. This poem, Frederick Arthur Davidson, for Rita Walker, written by Jonathan Davidson and read by Sue Brown. I think of my merchant navy grandfather, boarding a vessel, bound for the far north. Even to the end, a neat and abstemious man, perfectly turned out, a dab hand at sewing. He served me baked beans with curry powder, like they did at sea. He wanted revolution. That he was, on balance, wrong about how the world would sail itself is, on balance, irrelevant. He stood still on one of the decks as the ship cut its way through a choppy swell. And he moved with the mass of steel and water. A man at ease with the mass of steel and water. Thank you. The poem that I'd like to share with you all is called Attention Deficit Paints Me a View. Quietly seated, facing the direction of my intended arrival. The gangway stretched long and sleek before me, separating my view into left and right. Tranquil, almost sedated by the rhythmic motions of the electrical murmurs of the train, I turned to gaze through the large framed, sprawling window next to me. Appearing from nowhere, fluttering like an excited butterfly, a leaf is pinned to the glass directly in front of me, held down by the governing winds. A few seconds, and it's swept away, returning to whence it came. A moving gallery of cows, trees, pylons zooms by in the opposite direction, as though on a greenbelt conveyor, prompting a creative discourse between my mind's eye and the countrysides. Its stark, candid view presents a flotilla of cumulus grey clouds borne above the roaming scenes, fiercely rolling low like unfolding, imposing, manipulating halos stretched high above the green earthy mass of this remarkable and stunningly beautiful topography. This image, this semblance, comparable to any one of Constable's canvas masterpieces, simply holds my attentions. In contrast, windows to the right of me entertains pop-up clouds, smearing themselves provocatively across the spectacular blue heaven while trying to penetrate between the small gaps of dispersed dark rain clouds. Adding to this autumn composite, swirling sporadically in this boisterous airstream, an array of orange, aubens, reds, golden, and crispy brown leaves frolic ceaselessly within the season's cascade, amazingly in tune with Coltrane's Autumn Leaves serenading through my headphones. This magnificent land innately soaked in the deep richness of late autumn sunlight, exalting herself once again to the season's pulsating beat, life. Comfortingly, the vibration of the train gently rocks my view, which stretches long across the vista. Nature's semiotic offsprings, her vegetation, her flora, still holds their own, still suckles from Mother Earth's umbilical, the rich soil. How I salute autumn's impunities, the rejuvenator, the protector for the new and the regrowth, her healing force. But to my woeful thoughts, most passengers stare attentively at their mobile devices as nimble fingers unceremoniously tap numerous infectious choice keys. In retrospect, we sometimes forget that the heavens aren't simply hung above us as changing backdrop to hide space, or that beneath our feet, the ground is nothing more than something to walk upon, cold and dirty. It's far greater than that. They shoulder immense purpose with amazing possibilities and solid foundation for our befalling future, whether or not we care to acknowledge or appreciate nature's moments once in a while. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. The one thing that's missing from these events, of course, is this sound that I imagine people, I hope everyone's doing that at home and applauding in spirit at least. Thank you for that, Sue. Yeah. And thank you also, by the way, to the people who are pressing all the buttons behind the scenes to make this work so smoothly. So we've got Olivia, we've got Susanna, and we've got Katie helping us out and making this happen. And thank you for that. I wanted a little bit of a question. What strikes me as I listen to Jonathan's poem and then to Sue's is how even just with 2 or 3 poems giving us a flavour of how these poems play off against one another, how we read each poem that we come to differently for the one that we heard before. And I wanted to ask Sue, what does it mean to read another poet's work aloud in this way? Does it give you any different understanding or kind of connection to that poet?
It does, you know, through individuals and their writing, they're expressing their experiences, what they see, how they see the world. And that doesn't always mean it's the same with yourself. So reading someone else's poems or work, for me, there's always a bit of apprehension. And there was a little bit first when Jonathan had asked me, because I was thinking, well, how am I going to, you know, present this at the standard that I felt it needed? You know, I didn't want to lose anything. But I think part of that is connecting and trying to understand what has been written. In reading it aloud, I have to try and remember and imagine or hear Jonathan's reading in my head, and then somehow lift the words from the page using my own accents and phrasing and trying to find a balance.
That's really interesting, because when I do it, I try very hard to ignore completely how Jonathan would sound and to kind of own it myself. So Jonathan, you started this process. How does it feel to you hearing your work read by other people, and what does it mean to you to read another poet's work aloud?
Well, increasingly, as I've got older, I've become more interested in other people reading my poems than in me reading them myself. Perhaps it's similar if you're a performer of music, but also a composer. After a while, you actually are more interested in composing than performing. So perhaps I'm more interested in composing and performing now. And there are so many wonderful readers of poetry. I feel people outflank me. And in fact, Sue's reading of that poem when I first recorded it, and it's available on my website, it was the first person I'd asked to record a poem in a Commonplace. And the recording came back, and I really couldn't believe how extraordinary it was, how it had completely given me a different picture, opened up the poem, even though, as Sue says, she doesn't have the accent I have, and I don't have the accent my grandfather had. But somehow the humanity I'd wanted to communicate of that man who died many years ago and who obviously Sue has never met, somehow Sue managed to release that man's character and his position politically and physically within his life through that very short poem. And for me, what's important when we're reading poetry, be it our own or other people's, is that we are acting as a vehicle to release that poem. We are not the poem. We are only the physicality through which the poem passes. And once it's passed through us, it passes through other people, and it may never come back to us. And of course, eventually, I won't be here to read my poems, and I hope there will be no recordings of me reading them. But other people will be able to read my poems aloud, and they will carry on passing through other people and being released for other people's experience and so on. And for me, when I offer somebody a poem to read, it is, of course, a test. Is the poem good enough to be read by somebody else? And all the recordings I've had so far, 30 odd of them, have been wonderful. If any of them weren't wonderful, and that hasn't happened yet, but if they were, it would be because my poetry wasn't good enough. I would never blame the person reading it. I need to give within the poem all the skills and devices and directions necessary for somebody to release it well.
Well, we're going to come to our next guest reader in a moment, but I'm going to ask you both another question which leads on from that, really, which is, what does reading do to inform our writing? And I'm thinking particularly at the moment, I'm reminded every time I read a poem that poems have different meaning every time you read them. That sometimes, like Adelstrop, if you read Adelstrop now, Father and Father, all the birds of Oxfordshire and Gloucestershire, somebody coughed, now has an entirely different meaning than it did, even 3 months ago. That the sense of apprehension in it is increased by reading it now. And I just wondered, in a general sense, what you feel reading other poets does to improve or to change your own writing. If we can keep that fairly brief so we can go on to our next thrilling reader. So Sue, first, what does reading do to inform your writing?
Well, for me, it opens up a view, a place that I may never have been before, never experienced before. And if I had experienced something, hearing it in a different way, a different setting, presents something else for me. And then that itself allows me to say, okay, let me look at this. And so in my writing, I can look at things from a different perspective, language or culture or, anything.
Yeah, different windows. Jonathan, what about you?
For me, it's about understanding. Obviously, I want to understand the poem. And when I first started in this world, I believe you just read it and studied it and thought about it. But later on, I realized that if you spoke the poem out loud, preferably, you were for that moment inside the poem looking out, which is a much better place to be than outside the poem looking in. And if you're inside the poem looking out and the words are passing through your mind and through your voice, you will understand things that you wouldn't have understood just by reading it. So for me, to read a poem out loud is to truly understand it and take it into my heart, I suppose.
It's a way of borrowing wisdom, isn't it, really? And we could all do with a bit of that. So thank you for that, and thank you for the reading, Sue. I'm going to invite now our next poetry guest into this imaginary room, and our next reader is going to be Gregory Ledbetter, who is also going to read first a poem by Jonathan and then a poem of his own. Welcome, Greg.
Hello, thank you very much, Jo. Hello, Jonathan. Hello, Sue. Hello, everybody. It is indeed a huge pleasure to be here to help celebrate the launch of this wonderful new book. The first poem I'm going to read is by Jonathan. It's called The Silence, and its subtitle is, its epigraph, In Response to Cantus in Memoriam, Benjamin Britten, by Arvo Pärt. I like best the silence that is not silence, but our breathing, the orchestra of flesh and thought caught in looped arpeggios. But back to the silence. That comes at the start and finish and places a hand on our shoulder or takes our hands and leads us not to heaven or hell, but into the everlasting place of unknowing, from where we issued forth. But back to the silence, that for us on the surface of the earth is nothing like silence, but a continuous roar of obligation and dispatch, of coming and going. And for Benjamin Britten was the great bell tolling and then not tolling. And that is what I like best, the silence that is noisy like the bell, that we go back to from where we came. And the second poem is one of my own, and Jonathan has requested this one, and it's a poem from a sequence called Dendrites and Axons, which is written about my father's experience with vascular dementia. This is the second part of that sequence. The horse came apart as you drew her. Mismatched perspective, split between the fusilli head and something that looked like a pig's rear end. This was early enough for a nervous joke from someone, but though you never said as much, this was your test, and you knew. At the hospital, you had to draw a pentagon. Geometry itself broke open. Where there should have been one, you drew three, which overlapped like a Venn diagram. An epicenter in the white space. Chaos in its blossoming fractal. Thank you.
Sorry, it's just me clapping. Everyone else is mute. They're clapping vigorously but silently.
Joe,
as I like to think is the case at my readings, but sadly, often not. Thanks, Greg. The question I have for you is that you're a poet who explicitly acknowledges his debt to earlier poetry, and we all have crushes on various poets, don't we? Mine is on Norman MacCaig. I'd like to know a little bit about who yours are and what that relationship means in your own writing, the relationship with poets dead or alive who have influenced your own way of writing.
Yeah, it's a fundamental relationship. I think it begins with pleasure. You know, I think that's really important. I think that's one of the things that so often gets kind of driven out of the conversation about poetry, really. But it really is about pleasure and enjoyment in language, a delight in language. Begins in delight and ends in wisdom, as Frost said. But so I think that's the key thing. But it's also for me about learning, a kind of cultivation, a self-education. I mean, all education is self-education, really. And so it becomes a source of renewal. And the dead are often doing new things. You know, I mean, that's the thing. They're always up to something new. You kind of know what the living are up to, but the dead, I don't know, there's a sense of discovery. I mean, you mentioned earlier on about how you can come back to the same poem, you know, infinitely, and there's always something different happening. You never step into the same poem twice, as it were. And I think that's part of the delight of it for me. And I think, even the most familiar poems, in a way you have to sort of defamiliarize that relationship to, or you find a way of defamiliarizing your experience of that poem, and suddenly something can crack open that was quite unlooked for.
Yeah. I'm struck. The Poetry Exchange does a podcast, a series of broadcasts where they ask people not what is their favourite poem, but which poem has been a friend to them.
Yeah.
And it strikes me that in Jonathan's book, a lot of the poems, that's the kind of relationship we're looking at, poems that might keep company with you for a while and show you something about shared experience, as most good poems do. So thank you, Gregory. I'm going to keep moving on because we want to hear some more work from the book that we're here to celebrate. So I'm going to introduce now our next speaker, who is Peter Sansom. And Peter is another architect of the poetry world that we move in. He's one of the forces behind the Poetry Business, which is a well-loved, really a monument in poetry world, an organisation which publishes new work, organises poetry events and courses, and of course has published this book. And in this instance, he's also been Jonathan's editor, which is a very intimate and not always an easy relationship. So Peter, welcome. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about how A Commonplace evolved and where, literally, it started.
Yeah, well, first of all, it's a great pleasure to be here and to for the book to be almost upon us. It mostly came into being, I think, or the idea came into being in a place in the middle of Sheffield, Encliffe Park. Jonathan came up maybe half a dozen times, I would think, to talk about the book. When it began, it was just a series of poems. It was I'm not sure how good Jonathan is as a poet, but he is one of my favourite poets. And I think I like to say I've got extremely good, not just taste, but judgment. So that makes him an extraordinary poet. And I've known that actually since the 90s. Was it the 90s? His first book came out, The Living Room, from ARC. And since then, I've been very fortunate in being Jonathan's editor. And I'd assumed this was going to be another book of poems where I saw individual poems, which I liked very much. And I could see there were some that were going together, that were working together as a collection. Jonathan's actually, when you said that about it can be a difficult relationship, Jonathan likes the same, we've got the same wristwatch, we've got one each, and the same shoes, so perhaps that helps. I know that sometimes it can be a bit like arm wrestling with some poets, but that wasn't the case. Jonathan was very quick to see where I was questioning something in a poem, and very quick to make, very hardworking in that way that he was going back to the original impulse in writing it. So he was allowing his imagination to just rewrite rather than telling the poem what it ought to be. And then in this park, in the cafe at brunch one day, I think we'd been working on Jonathan's earlier book on poetry, which is oddly called On Poetry. And that's it's a prose book thinking about how poems work and among other things, discussing a lot of individual poems. And I think then Jonathan mentioned that he was thinking about this being a commonplace book, and the idea evolved into including other people's work. Jonathan quotes something from Ted Hughes. He realized that in 1989, Ted Hughes has said, "I've been thinking of making a selection of my verses and setting them in a commentary like Dante's Vita Nuova, the pieces that I mostly read at readings." And then he said, "No, that's heresy. I couldn't get away with doing that. Even Ted Hughes couldn't get away with doing that." I want to say one other thing about Jonathan's Jonathan's poetry, which is that I think Jonathan, more than anybody, hates the idea of being seen as self-important. But equally, he knows that poems can't afford to lack ambition even if it's a quiet ambition, because otherwise you're selling poetry and people short, really. Poems can be big things, even when they're about something domestic or quite tiny. And I think that's what's happened with his book. The individual poems are as good as anything that Jonathan's own poems are as good as any that he's been writing in his career. And so that means they're very good indeed. But then this whole project, because it's not just the poems in the page, it's also to do with audio and so on. Just extraordinary, really.
I absolutely agree. He hates pomposity, and I love it that he's sitting here muted so that you and I can talk about him, with him squirming quietly in the background, and say that wisdom and generosity of spirit which characterizes the poems is what makes them so strong and confident. But it comes with a sense of modesty and of the poet not foregrounding himself, always making space for other people. It's a trick I wish I could do better, and he does it constantly, and it is a real joy, but a thing that really lends itself to this idea of a commonplace and needs a generous writer to do it. I found in a charity shop some time ago W.H. Auden's Commonplace book, which I think is called A New World, and it's fantastic. It has none of Auden's own work in it. It just has his extracts from other writers, but it's indexed with, it has things like landscape, basalt, landscape, granite, and you're thinking, yes, there is landscape, a limestone. And you learn so much about a poet by being given privy access to what that poet reads and thinks about it, and Jonathan does that. And I do love the footnotes as well. I can't remember whether it's in this one or in on poetry, where there's a little footnote that says, "This is my favorite geological formation." What is your favorite geological formation? Or is it an equation, Jonathan? Anyway, one of those two. And I just remember laughing out loud and thinking, there's no one else who would do that in a book. So it's a book that at every level is full of treasures. It's like a little 3D puzzle. So I'm going to remind you, by the way, if you're watching us, that we need your questions. So if we are to interrogate Jonathan and really make him uncomfortable, as we all wish to do at the end of this event, we need your questions about his work and about poems in general. So we've got several poets and poetry peeps, people with all kinds of different perspectives here. And I wanted to ask, before we move on, what is the common place? What is the resource that we all share as poets? And I'll come to Jonathan to answer that first in a moment, but for me it's the language. But it's for me, poetry is a kind of communion, a kind of sharing, where we say, this is my private, specific, individual experience. I offer it to you to see what we have in common. And if my experience of life chimes with you and you say, yes, it is like that, even though I'm from Sheffield and you're from Grenada or whatever, there is something that we can both share in that. So what's the common ground that we stand on in poetry, Jonathan? Is he thinking?
Yes, for me, I suppose I'd describe it. I've got very unstable internet, so I think I've probably frozen for a second, and now I've unfrozen. I'm hoping I've unfrozen. Everybody's nodding. Excellent. I was about to say something really, really important, but instead I'll say that when I think about poetry, the common thing for me is that poems have a kind of radioactivity, a good radioactivity. When we come close enough to them, we become irradiated, I think is probably the term. Poems have a kind of half-life. Very good poems have a half-life of several thousand years. Less impactful poems have a shorter half-life. So I've spent my life trying to get irradiated by radioactive poems in the hope that it will, as Ready Brek used to, keep me warm in the long, cold evenings of my life.
Crackle in your poems and in your consciousness. I'm going to come to Sue in a minute, but first I'm going to interrogate Greg. So Greg, what do you think we share? What do we have in common as poets?
Oh gosh, I mean, I think it's turning language into an organ of psychophysiological growth. And so there's something physical and somatic about it. So a word touches you. I mean, we use that word, I was touched by such and such a thing, but actually it sort of feels metaphorical, but it's actually not for me, or perhaps it's something between literal and metaphorical. So it's that palpable sense of acceleration, a quickening of your own being, and a quickening that is shared through the medium of language.
So it's a tool for experiencing the world with and thinking about the world.
An organ, yeah. It's one of our organs.
Yes, yes. Brilliant, thank you. Sue, what do you think? What do we have in common as poets? What do we all have at our fingertips?
We have a world's view, and we like to capture the moment and paint images using words, using language, using sounds even, that can be viewed and expressed, you know, for a lifetime. And by, as we were saying, different people, depending on that moment, as you said about the cough in the poem.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was mentioned then. And today a cough will have a different point of view, perspective, you know. And I think it's the magic of capturing the physical world and placing it onto the page.
Yeah, brilliant.
Again.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a different tool for representing what we see around us. Peter, do you want to add anything to that? What's the commonplace? You see more poets than most of us do, and work in development as well as work that's been published on the page and in the North. So what do we share? What's our commonplace?
They are various, aren't they, poets? An uncertainty of poets, or an overlookedness of poets, and we don't expect to be seen as poets, and yet when we are experienced, it's the most full experience. You know, a poem can, as Greg was saying, it just makes it changes us physically, and it makes a difference to us. And when we pick up a book and open it, that machinery, that when you read a poem, it's exactly the same, I imagine, as when it was written, really, or very similar, and we can do it again. And where what we have in common sometimes is at poetry readings or like events like this, where people can share in that experience. And one of the nice things about this book of Jonathan's, Commonplace, is that it is a lot of the things that he says in the book, in the commentary and so on, he would have said introducing the poem to reading, which of course
yes.
You would have said in a normal book of poems, would you? It's just that it's amplified or within the context of other people's poems.
No, I love that. I especially like that, and I think that too often people are a bit snobby about people introducing or explaining poems, when in fact a little bit of context, or a little bit not to supplement the poem, but to give it another, as at a music concert where perhaps the origin of the song is explained, it gives you another dimension and another way of accessing it and another way of plugging it into your own experience. So all of that is brilliant and thought-provoking. Thank you very much. I'm just going to remind you that oh yes, you can, but I'm going to first of all remind people to send us their questions, to just keep typing in comments for questions. You were going to rudely interrupt me, I think.
Oh, good. I was interrupting you. As people will have gathered, I'm suffering from an unstable internet connection, which is a condition you get when you get to my age. But I'm hoping I'm making myself perfectly clear. And I'd like to interject on the subject of communicating to ask if you might do me the honor of reading one of my poems and then increase that honor 4 or 5-fold by reading one of your own poems.
Right,
and I haven't told you the title of the poem. No, it's good. We're paid by the pound. So I'd like you to read the poem which I wrote probably 15 years ago about my experience, maybe 35 years ago, called Apple Picking, and then to follow that with your poem called Lifted, which I understand is about how a narrowboat goes through a lock on a canal, which is of personal interest to me too. Thank you.
Okay, this is a poem you asked me to record a little while ago called Apple Picking. And when you asked me to record it, I had not heard you read it. And so I was able to read it my own way. And you said I did okay. So I hope this works. Apple Picking by Jonathan Davidson. It's autumn and I'm working at picking the last of the small apples. They've grown without check. They glitter in the slight breeze. It takes a young man and a tapered ladder and some nerve to reach them. In the big wooden shed, the women of the village and one old man are grading my catch. I'm the last picker, sent to finish off because I've recently fallen in love and am incapable of doing much else other than swaying in treetops. So now I'm nudging the ladder into the branches and taking 2 rungs at a time, holding a basket. I lever, pivot, lean and stretch out to twist the apples from their sprues. I listen for the soft, short snap of stem parting company. What I pick, I set down as gently as I can. Apples bruised beneath the skin, unnoticed, until days later they bloom into decay. And damaged apples are discarded. The women of the village see to that. Working, I think of the young woman I've fallen in love with, how we found the pale scars on her body when we undressed each other. An accident as a child, scalding water, nothing more. I had put my face to her damaged skin and drawn in her rain-washed smell, not realizing how this must have hurt or how much love it took to let me see her. And I did not wish that she was different. I wished that I was. I think that's lovely. And one of the things I love about Jonathan's poems in general is how they use very clean, precise, plain language, Methodist language, if you like, the plain song, to sing a song which is nevertheless beautiful. So this is my poem called Lifted, which I think Jonathan likes partly because he has sometimes crewed for me on a narrowboat and knows that if this poem works on one level, it will instruct you how to work a canal boat through a narrow lock. But like all poems, it's not, a poem is never about what it's about. It's always a metaphor for other things. And so this is a poem called Lifted. The land says, come uphill. And water says, I will, but take it slow. A workman's ask, and nothing fancy. Will you? Here's an answer, engineered. A leisurely machine, a box of oak and stone, the mitered lock, the water's yes. We're stopped. The bow bumps softly at the bottom gate and drifts. All water wants, all water ever wants is to fall. So we use the fall to lift us. Make of water its own tool, as simple as a crowbar or a well-tied knot. Open up the paddles, let it dam and pucker, lift, and with it lift us like a bride, a kite, a wanted answer, breath no longer held, or like a boat. We're on our way and rising. Water rushes in like fools. These tonnages that slip across the sill, all dirty bottle green and gathering into a giddy hurl, then slower, slow, until it ends in glassy bulges, hints of aftermath, a cool and thorough spending. Wait, then, for the shudder in the gate, the backward drifting boat that tells you there and here are level, an imbalance righted. Ask of water, help me rise. And water says, I will. So thank you for asking me to share that one. It does make me think of working through locks. And as I recall, you were the only crew member ever to turn up in a full 3-piece suit of tweed.
Yes, that
gone.
is true. I misread the instructions on the. That is true. I misread the instructions on the invitation. I assumed it was informal. Had I known it was formal dress, I would have been in a dress suit.
Yes, could have been worse. Could have been worse, I like to think. So thank you for asking me to read that. And I do think, however, it is time that we heard a little bit more of the work from your book, which is what we're here to celebrate. So I'm going to ask you to read some work now, and I'm going to ask you, I think, to read The Back Roads.
Well, unfortunately, for contractual reasons, I'm forbidden to read The Back Roads when my internet service is unstable, as it is this evening. So fortunately, by strange chance, I had asked a young person to record The Back Roads, the daughter of my work colleague, Liv Chapman, my friend and work colleague, Liv Chapman. Zoe Chapman has recorded this for us. What you will need to know before you hear her read it, she's a very young person, and she's done a wonderful job of reenacting the experience that my sister and I had on many occasions when led through the countryside by our father, by our dad, who claimed to know a back route which would cut off many miles. It transpired typically that my dad didn't know the back roads quite as well as he thought he did. So this poem is about that experience of being led through the English, Welsh or Scottish countryside by a well-meaning but sometimes slightly misguided man, my father. Let's hear The Back Roads, read by Zoe Chapman.
The back roads. And he would take the back roads that often led to ploughed fields, barbed wire, farmers with shotguns, and once to a wooden footbridge over a river with a sign saying condemned. We crossed, of course. That was my dad. Where is he now? I swore I wouldn't take the back roads, but here I am lifting my bike over a stile, wading a ford, crossing a rifle range. Here I am on the back roads, and that figure ahead vaulting a 5-bar gate as one shouldn't. It is my father.
That's magic. I have to say, when we first knew that we were going to, when you first said this is a young reader, I hadn't realised quite how young that reader was going to be. And I briefly wondered if it was being played at the wrong speed. But that was a fantastic reading. Thank you, Zoe. That's brilliant. But I can't help noticing that it's not you, Jonathan. And so I'm going to ask you once again, please, to read a poem from your book. And the one I'd like you to read is Borders.
Well, it's unfortunate you've asked for that poem because due to a small contractual consideration, it's been decided that poem should be read by a relative of mine, and it's my daughter, Molly, who has done a wonderful recording of this poem, Borders. And I asked her to do that recording because she has spent some time traveling through Europe, as every young person should do, and we hope she can spend other times in the future traveling through Europe, but unfortunately the borders are starting to reassert themselves. So I asked Molly to record this poem, The Borders, which she's now going to read for us. Thank you, Molly.
Borders by Jonathan Davidson, read by Molly Davidson. They are bringing back the borders. So a night train winds to a dead halt, and in the blazing darkness of suspicion, uniformed men, just doing a job, thump through doors and fill the corridors with their orders and mistrust. They are looking for the others, not you. But still your eyes look to your shoes, in need of spit and polish. You hope they do not stop. They stop. You hear the hum of electricity. Voices demand papers. And it begins.
Thank you, Molly. That's chilling indeed and beautifully read. And that love for the spoken word clearly carries on in your poetry dynasty. The reason I've been disappearing from your screens, by the way, if you've had us all on screen at once, is that I've been writing down some of the questions that we've got from audience members. We have over 150 people watching us at present, so that's very good to know, and really nice to feel that we've got people from so many places watching, which brings us together in a different way. However, I am reminded of Father William in Alice in Wonderland, who says, I have answered 3 questions and that is enough. I have asked you once, I have asked you twice, and I shall now, Jonathan Davidson, ask you for a 3rd time. Will you please read a poem from your new book? And the one I would like you to read is A Letter to Johann Joachim Quantz.
Okay, I'll read that poem. We should know before we hear it notes that I would have put in the book, which is to say that Johann Joachim Quantz, as you will all know, was born in 1697 and died in 1773. He was a flautist, a composer, and he taught Frederick the Great how to play the flute. He was featured in a poem by another poet called W.S. Graham, and in that poet, Graham imagines Johann Joachim Quantz teaching a lout from the canals how to play the flute, who was a simple working man but happened to have a gift for flute playing. So this poem is imagining that young man, slightly older now, writing back to his tutor to tell him what it was like to take art and culture out into the wider world as a simple man paid to entertain the newly rich. It is in the form of a letter, and there's a quote from W.S. Graham at the start, which is, "Do not be sentimental or in your art," which I think roughly distills down to don't take yourself too seriously. A letter to Johann Joachim Quantz. Sir, you tutored me to not expect applause, and I was not disappointed, though it was still chilblain weather. My fingers lifted like lapping water, letting and stopping the sounds to make, I hardly reckoned how, one of your capriccios. So they stood me, my hands hard from hauling ropes, my face weather reddened, in a sweating corner of a silk room, and pretended to listen. What forced and servant music rippled through the chambers of the recently rich and along the canals. I was a carrier, as the barge, the smack, the wherry is, of freight or ballast, and out I went, into the Baltic or the German Sea. So they kept me for this purpose only, and great service did I do them all, bearing away the frightening silence.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And that
wasn't so bad in the end.
It wasn't so bad in the end, you know. And that tone of solemnity and wit and thoughtful wisdom is what I expect from all of the poems in this book and everything that I read of yours. We have some questions for you, unsurprisingly. And I've been jotting some of them down. We're going to start with one that you will have heard before, but which is still always a good question. Someone from York asking, how do you know that something that happens or something that you see will be a good topic, a fit topic for a poem? Do you just experience something and a poem just starts to form as if alive, or not?
Almost never. I tend to arrive at a poem because I've arrived at a few words or a phrase, and thinking about that phrase or those words and playing with them suddenly opens up an idea or a memory or a recollection. So I'm not driven by thinking I must write about something that's happened to me because it was very impactful. I'm more driven by arriving at some language which then suggests to me that I could write about something important using this language. And to illustrate that point further, when I read poetry by other people, sometimes I get the sense that the poem is reading me, that it understands what I would have said had I been as good as the poet is. And the poet is reading my own mind and I'm just reading that back. So in a way, with my method of composing it is to see what the words are saying to me, which instance in my life do they want to write about. And in fact, I've been in many workshops run by Peter Samson and Anne Sansom, where they've used that very technique to give you a fairly innocuous few phrases, point of reference, idea. And from that, you suddenly find all sorts of stuff coming out that you write about, which you had no idea you were going to write about. So I hope that's answered that question to some extent.
Yes, I remember Anne speaking in a workshop about trying to write in a condition of being half drunk, which often happily is exactly what I do. They sadly aren't always that great when I come back to them sober. So we've got quite a few questions rolling in now, and we are going to get through as many of those as we can. We're going to wind up by past at the very latest, by the way, folks. So, and if Jonathan's video has disappeared for a moment, that's because he has got an unstable video connection, and we're finding that it's making the sound just wobble a little bit on some of his answers. So it might be best not to see his blushes as he answers the next question, which is, to the best of your knowledge, says Rod Whitworth, are you the only poet to include praise for the Brooks leather bicycle saddle in a poem?
Sadly not, no. There's a club of us, and every year we promise to write a poem about the Brooks saddle. I'm surprised he hasn't come across more of those. And in fact, I'm not on video now, and I'm not sure what image you're seeing, but if you're seeing my my holding image, it's of me in my cycling rig alongside my trusty Mercian, which is, of course, shod with a Brooks B24.
We can't see the saddle, tragically, but we can see the elegant curve of your handlebar, as it were.
And my legs, yes. I was breaking them in for a friend.
What poem, says Kate Innes, has provided particular comfort over the past few months or years? And that's a little bit like Jeff's question as well. Jeff Phelps asks, which poem or poet has been a friend to you? Perhaps that's the same kind of question.
Yeah. So I go back to some poets that I stumbled across when I was young, in my early 20s. Peter Didsbury. There are probably 14, maybe 15 of us in the world who read Peter Didsbury, possibly more. But I love him, and I read his poems not just for the curiosity of them and the fact that they take a deal of thinking about, but because they've been with me for 30 years. I've known these poems longer than I've known my children. They're not as important as my children, of course, but they give me something every time I read them. And they remind me that that particular poet, although he does not know it, is, and in a good way, very radioactive. His poems have a very long half-life in my mind. They still keep working for me. So Peter Didsbury, yes. I can't name other individual poets, perhaps. No, I'll stop there. There are probably other questions. Didsbury's enough.
They're different every day anyway. If any of us are asked that question, it's a bit like Desert Island Discs, isn't it? It's like, oh, I can choose 8 today, but there'll be 8 different ones tomorrow. So here's a good procedural question from Fran Hill. At which point do you feel or know that a poem is finished?
It can take decades. The poem Apple Picking, which you read, I think I started writing that in around 2005, about an incident that had happened or a situation I was in 15 or 20 years earlier than that. So it took at least 14 years before I felt it was worth being published. It probably went through maybe 60 or 70 drafts. I don't normally do quite so many, but I do believe in hammering away at poems to try and make them better. Occasionally they fall apart in the process, but if they're strong, they'll survive. So
and when you talk
I don't know how
drafts,
I know when I'm finished. But
when you talk about drafts, Jonathan, do you mean taking a semicolon out and putting it back, or do you mean completely transform? How deep does a transformation go? What does a typical edit look like?
I mean, it might be an afternoon spent taking a semicolon out and putting it in again, as Oscar Wilde described, but It's more often writing it out again, definitely writing it by hand or retyping it again, but typically writing it by hand, possibly changing the point of view, changing the person, changing the tense, changing the verse structure, changing the meter, changing everything to see if I can get back to the original impulse that prompted the poem. I'm trying to edit back to what I started with, because as soon as you start to write, you lose the essence of the thing you're writing about almost by its very nature. It's like when you buy a second-hand car. The minute you stick your key in the door, it's you buy a new car. The minute you put the key in the door, it's a second-hand car, not quite as good. So I'm always trying to get back to the original, the genesis of the poem. So I work and work and work to try and find what it was at the very start that prompted me thinking about it. And the more you write, the more you have to take away. Yes.
Yeah, which we're getting some great questions in now, and you can tell that these are people who are wrestling with these questions themselves in their writing. One of them is, why do you think poets often write more about where they came from rather than where they are?
Well, we need emotion recollected and tranquility. I think that was Wordsworth, wasn't it? It's a very, very good thing he said there. If you write about the past, it's safer. The people you're writing about are in the distance, even if you still know them and are with them. I think we want to understand our own autobiography, to work out what we did, to possibly justify what we did, or to condemn ourselves sometimes. I have a poem in the new collection which really is about condemning myself, talking about how when I was not such a good human being. So I think that's why we write about the past. Also, if you write about the past, it will never be out of date, because it started off as the past and it just gets more and more in the past. Whereas if you write about the moment now, a poem about contemporary life, pretty quickly it will feel like it's a poem about the past. So you may as well start with the past. I suppose that's my feeling. Sheer idleness on my part. I might try and put my video on again to see how that works. Let's see how it goes.
Okay. I'm not sure you've ever not been a good person, but I certainly think that poems have to cost us something, and that if we try and look too good in our poems, it doesn't always work. So that was that question, which is very good. I'm just scanning through. We've got lots of questions coming in now, which are all really good. One is from Richard O'Brien, who you'll know, who asks, how did you find going back from writing an instructional guide on poetry to writing your own poetry? Did it change how you approach your work?
Well, certainly, had I not written on poetry and written about why I liked many other poems and how I'd experienced poetry as a heard art form, I wouldn't have hit upon the idea of writing my own book of poems and including commentary and giving myself and other people what I felt was needed to fully experience the poems. It's going to be very difficult in the future not to keep on doing that. I feel like I'm on my own here. I'm out in uncharted waters to some extent. Ted uses with me a little bit of the way, perhaps, but I don't think I'll ever be able to go back to writing poems with myself too. So to answer Richard's question properly, I was probably more aware of how the work might be received and what I needed to do to help people receive the work. I felt a democratic responsibility to give people the means of understanding, not the means of production, but the means of understanding. If you give people the means of understanding, they will understand your poems. I'm going to switch my video off again because yet again my internet has become unstable at the very reference of the means of understanding.
Okay, we have a couple of brilliant questions. I'm going to ask you this one and give you a moment to think about it before we come back to it. Jonathan, as a committed lifestyle and political cyclist, what are your top 3 bicycles? And if they were poets, which poets would they be? Right, so obviously that's a little thought might be required for you to answer that one. But Amélie Doche, I hope I pronounced your name correctly, says, it seems that in Commonplace, your real self or voice is in conversation with your poetic self or voice, and it blurs the boundaries between real world and text world. Are you happy for them to see for readers to see those two selves together, or do you want to keep a separation between your poetry self and your real self?
Okay, briefly on the bicycles, I used to be a Colnago and now I'm a committed Mercian. A Mercian will outlive me, and that's what I'm after. In terms of being in conversation with myself, that's an astute observation. Yes, I am, and indeed in my early book on poetry, my footnotes often disagree with myself. I set up a tension even within my own self as the writer. But I also want to be in conversation with my listeners and my readers. I want to open up the poems to them. I don't want them to feel that the poems are a version of unseen criticism, which people used to get in exams. I'm not good at exams. I never enjoyed that side of engaging with literature. And I don't want people to feel that when they open my book, they're going to have to struggle to understand what the hell it is I'm trying to tell them or observe for them. And so on, I want them to feel that I am offering the poem to them for them to understand, and for them, if they wish, to pass on to someone else, and for the poem to join the Commonwealth of poems, which have kept me going over 56 years and will hopefully keep other people going for many generations onwards.
Yes, it's apart from anything else, both On Poetry and A Commonplace are good. They're sort of gateway drugs. They're gateway books through which people might get a really 3D sense of what poetry can do, and then maybe dip their toes into the water still further. We've got a question from Bert Flitcroft, which I think I can answer for you, which is, could we ask Greg to read again the first poem that he read, your poem? Bert, you'll be able to hear this again, I think, later on. You should be able to replay a recording of this and hear Greg reading that one. He said it went a little bit too quick for him to appreciate it. Right, I'm going to give 3 more questions. Peter Arscott, a friend of Ledbury Festival and friend to poetry. Have you ever abandoned writing a poem, like giving up a long cycle ride with saddle sores? If you can answer that without embarrassing yourself, could you? Have you ever abandoned a poem like that?
Well, I've never abandoned the cycle ride. I mean, I've been absolutely knocked out and come back completely drained because I haven't had enough cake at the cafe. But I've never abandoned the cycle ride. I've always dragged myself home. I don't abandon poems so much as I put them away. I keep every single poem I've ever started, every piece of paper I've ever written on, every computer file I've ever typed a poem onto. So I have thousands of pieces of paper, and I might go back to some of them. I do sometimes repurpose a poem and decide it's going to be better used in a different way, or maybe I'll just use a bit of it and leave the other bit to come back for some other use. So no, I'm quite... I'm always aware of the importance of recycling and not wasting any language. So I try to get something from everything I start with. Yes.
Question from Margaret Keeping. Your family was pretty extraordinary, and it is a force in your poetry. Has that been painful or comfortable?
My family, I've discovered them more, I think, through writing the poems. As you'll gather from reading the book, my mother had no family. She was adopted. Her adopted parents died, and then she was looked after by an aunt. So in a way, she didn't really have much of a family for us to think about. But on my father's side, I always knew, and I think my sister would agree with me, that we had a different family, a family which was unorthodox, partly because of their politics. My father and my grandfather and other members of the family were committed communists in the grand tradition of being English radicals. Very traditional to be a radical in England, and my family represented that tradition, not English, British, I suppose, of wanting to make the world different and wanting to make the world better, and not accepting what they were given by those who said they got all they were going to get. And I always had that in the back of my mind. I've not been as politically active as my dad was, or perhaps my grandfather was, but maybe I will be in the future. But that's very important to me. And the knowledge that with that political belief comes complexity, because when you mix the oil of political belief on the water of day-to-day life, you often get an odd mixture, and sometimes it can go up in flames. My father, could be a cantankerous person at times, particularly if he'd taken us down the back roads. But deep down, I knew and know that he was a good man who wanted good things for people and better things for so many people. And all of my family, I feel, wanted that. And so I carry that with me, that knowledge that I have a duty of care as to how I write about them, but they represent not just the people who are my blood relatives, but they represent a spirit of Britishness, which I would like to see going on into the future. You're still muted, I think, Joe. No, you're not. You're still muted again. Thrice you're muted.
Ta-da!
There you are.
Sorry, I was trying to unmute myself, and so was the host, and what we were actually doing was both muting me at the same time. So that was a beautiful and very deep answer. And I think this book does so much of that. I think of your poems as very English, specifically English. Maybe that's just how I read them, but they seem to me quiet and deep, and poems that I think people will experience again and again and again, and sometimes are slow burners that one would come back to again and again. We have a last question for you, and I'm going to remind all the viewers, by the way, that if you are going to order the book, or if you already have ordered the book, it will be with you right at the end of this month, we think. So you're not far away from having a copy in your hands. But the last question is, have you had a reading of one of your poems done which surprised you, and how so?
Yes, I have. In fact, even today, I uploaded on my website a second reading of a poem called Won't, which is about my mum reading a poem she first read to me when I was a few years old. And in writing the poem, I was writing about how interesting it was that this poem we shared when I was a child and she was a young mother, how that still affected us 53 maybe years later. And as I had the poem read to me by two friends and I put the recordings up on the internet, I realized that it made it sound like I somehow wanted to break away from my mother, that I didn't want to stay with her, which wasn't my intention at all, although possibly subliminally, maybe it was my intention. Maybe in the writing of the poem, I revealed something about my relationship. I've always had a lovely relationship with my mum, but at the same time, when I came to leave home, I didn't stop to think what it would be like for her when I left. I just left, which kids do when you're 20 or 21 or 22, you just leave home. You don't think about how it affects your parents. You just assume that's what happens. And perhaps that poem was talking back to me to tell me, Jonathan, you should have been more aware of what it was like for your parents, your mum particularly, when you left home. And you should have thought about that a little bit more than you did. So the poem surprised me by telling me something about myself that I hadn't realized.
Which might be why you started writing it. They're often circular in that way, aren't they? That you aren't quite sure why you want to explore an issue, and then you find out gradually through reading it, or indeed through hearing other people read it, that it doesn't mean what you thought it meant, or that it means more than you thought it meant. So that's brilliant. Thank you so much. They've been very frank and moving answers, and they've expanded still further on what you've done in A Commonplace in telling us about the poems. I'm going to wind up in a moment and remind you all that there will be a screen that you're going to see at the end of this that tells you how to buy the book and shows you again the magnificent cover. I want to thank Jonathan and Greg Ledbetter, Sue Brown, Peter Sansom, and I want to thank all of you for watching, because it's a peculiar way of experiencing poetry, but it still feels to me, and I hope it does to you, that the same sense of communion and sharing and being deeply interested in one another for a short while is exactly the same as if we were all in a room together. So thank you for giving us this time and your ears. And I'm going to invite Jonathan to finish this event by reading a final poem, please, from A Commonplace.
Okay, thank you very much. And Joe, thank you for sharing this event, for presenting it so wonderfully well. And apologies to everybody for the internet in my part of the Midlands being slightly dodgy this evening. I understand people are watching something called Netflix. which I'm unaware what that is, but it's very popular and it uses up all the juice. I'm going to keep my video off because I don't want me to break up again, and I might break up. This poem from my book, A Commonplace, is called Father, and it's about my dad. And the only thing you need to know, particularly about the poem, is that towards the end of his life, maybe 2 years or so before he died, he'd gone out for a walk, as he often did, down the hill from where he'd lived for 40 years. And he crossed underneath the railway bridge into the new part of Didcot, the new estates. And he got completely lost. He was an elderly man. His eyesight wasn't wonderful. And he just became distressed at having got lost. And thankfully, somebody spotted that he wasn't very happy and they phoned the police. And the police, who in Didcot were lovely, they picked him up and brought him back and put him on the list of elderly people who needed to be looked into occasionally, make sure that nothing like that happened again. But it was a shocking incident, I think, for me and probably for my sister as well, to know that our father could get himself lost in the town in which he'd spent most of his adult life. So this is called Father. I walked with my invisible father out into the fields on the edge of town, but they are gone now. New roads, new names, new people. Dad, stay here for a while, I said, and I'll go and find out what has happened to our lives. He sat on the newly installed bench. And when I returned, furnished with stories of change, I found him utterly dead. His cold eyes on the cold world closed. So many years he had lived here and then this. His roads renamed, his fields built over, his people now coming into view as strangers. Thank you very much, and good night.